Good afternoon, everyone. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce today Professor Stephen Wolf, a Cornell faculty member. Dr. Wolf teaches and conducts research on environmental governance, specifically focusing on secure public goods from private landscapes, mostly in India and China. His approach includes engagement in sociology, focusing on environmental and natural resource sociology, conservation planning and management, institutional analysis, innovation systems, and sustainable development. Professor Wolf has a BS in chemistry from University of Vermont, MS in urban and environmental planning from University of Virginia, and a PhD in environmental studies from University of Wisconsin-Madison. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wolf. The floor is yours.
Thank you for that introduction, and thanks for the chance to be here, Lucelene, for inviting me, and for the other panelists. It's a pleasure. Personally, I'm very cold. I would really like to start with some yoga, but I'll spare you that. For some reason, I just find myself very chilled. What I want to talk today in reference to the theme of networks that work is about some ongoing research that I'm conducting with students and colleagues on U.S. agri-environmental policy. It is true that I'm working in India and China, but most of my work is really in Western Europe and the United States. I work mostly in industrialized countries, and I'm interested in the policy challenge of integrating climate change, particularly mitigation, into existing policy networks, policy communities. That these are networks of organizations and actors with traditions and knowledge and culture, and it's not so easy for them to learn new tricks. You know, the idea of adaptation or adoption or technological change or learning implies that we're really very flexible and we're really very open. But I think many of us would recognize that that's not true. I think they say that physics moves ahead with the death of every great physicist, right? The idea is that the ability to actually learn, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You can't even teach a young dog new tricks. So I really want to talk about kind of friction or resistance or lock-in, if you will. And so while I get the sense that Lucelene wants to emphasize the positive, it's not in my nature. So I try. But I think the story is largely an intellectual story. It's not a story that we know the answer to, but the current conclusion, and it's not a murder mystery, so I tell you the conclusion is that the capacity and the extent to which U.S. is prepared or has internalized commitments to address climate change inside of agri-environmental policy is very weak. The good news is there's lots of opportunity for future learning and growth and change. The bad news is that up to this point, they have not internalized that. And so I want to walk through kind of the derivation of this question and make some comments about the history of agri-environmental policy and why it is this history makes it difficult to internalize this new commitment, which most of us would recognize is kind of an imperative. We've got to deal with this problem. Well, that's the normative. We've got to, we've ought to, we should. But where the rubber meets the road in terms of taking policy networks, taking communities of incumbents, these are actors who are in positions of authority, and getting them to do new things or do things differently, it's not so easy. Chris, can I have a clue? How would you like me to advance? Aha, thank you. I appreciate it. Just in terms of terminology, that I want to talk about agri-environmental policy in the United States. Here I'm really talking about national policy. In the United States, every 5 years, in theory, we pass a farm bill, an omnibus piece of legislation, which is all-encompassing. In that farm bill is a conservation title, an element of the budget, an element of the rules, an element of the programs devoted to environment. I'm going to talk about local development. That's really the name of this seminar series, is Local Development for Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation. And the local is not a community. It's not a place. It's a community of interest. It's the agri-environmental policy community. So it's the United States Department of Agriculture, particularly the Natural Resource Conservation Service. It's farmers and farm professional organizations. It's agribusiness, both input suppliers and downstream processors, and a range of other actors, NGOs involved in rural development and environment, who comprise this localized community, a community of interest. Greenhouse gas mitigation, I'll learn from you. I don't know too much about it. And networks that work. Here I'm really talking about the ability of the policy community to internalize new commitments and also to resist or to co-opt, pervert opportunities and resources. So we're talking about the agri-environmental policy community confronted with a new challenge and a new opportunity. And the story is largely one of not changing their ways, or at least not changing them in ways that would be particularly fast. So what do we learn when we think about how climate change intersects with agri-environmental policy? We're talking about the internalization of a new challenge, and we're also talking about a collision, institutional friction of the intersection between a domain of climate change policy, which largely I want to characterize as market-oriented, that the European trading system, ETS, under the Kyoto Protocol, is largely the model that I understand to be functioning as the mainstream of climate change mitigation. And that's a logic largely of accounting and offsets and market-based approaches to dealing with providing incentives for private actors to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. I want to argue that the culture and the history and the structure and the norms and the knowledge of agri-environmental policy is, to be provocative, incompatible with this market impulse. So I want to characterize climate governance as market-oriented, and I want to characterize agri-environmental policy as not market, or to put it in very stark terms. And I want to suggest that it's oil and water. And again, I'm characterizing this in a very kind of stylized way. So when we think about climate change mitigation and policy, we can always think about kind of generic and conceptual and theoretical ideas about policy. But these always have to be adopted and implemented on the ground in particular places with particular actors. And it's always valuable to take an actor-centered approach. And oftentimes the literature will talk about individual farmers or local residents. And that's really not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the local actors in policy networks. So these are bureaucrats, they're policy analysts, they're a variety of professionals in the policy process who are real people with real interests, with real biases, and real friction to change. So, kind of segueing out, I think typically we can think about problems with implementing climate change mitigation from what I'm going to call a payment for ecosystem services model, or an incentive-based approach to paying people to change their behavior, is that the transaction costs for measuring and making changes are too high. That's a classic microeconomic argument. It's a generic explanation of why we don't see a lot more payment for ecosystem services and why we don't see more climate change mitigation. I want to suggest that there's a companion explanation, which is this idea of networks or organizational friction. And the idea is that there's stickiness, there's friction in institutional processes and policy change, and history matters. Agri-environmental policy in this country and Western Europe largely comes out of a period in the mid-1980s. And we have 25 to 30 years of practice doing agri-environmental policy for soil erosion and water quality and some other ecological risks, wetlands, for example. Now, we have seen agri-environmental policy learn and adapt and internalize and flex in response to these changes in ecological science and recognizing new risks and new landscape imperatives. And the question is, well, can it just internalize commitments to climate change in the same way that agri-environmental policy has succeeded in internalizing other risks and threats? As the public and as science turns to agriculture and says, hey, we need you guys to deal with problem X, problem Y, problem Z. Agriculture has, they have their hand out, what are you going to pay me? But they've been paid to do it. And the suggestion I want to make is that the market bias, the market logic of climate change is a real challenge to agri-environmental policy, because up to this point, they have not functioned on a market basis. And so this history is important. It conditions, it structures, if you will, it locks them into a certain way of doing business. And these institutional networks, this collection of actors, are defended. They're not weak, they're not stupid, they're not asleep. They're engaged, they're powerful, they're well connected, and they are actively engaged in defending themselves and conditioning the way that climate change is presented to agriculture. They are not passive, they are active. And so those networks, they work, but maybe not in the same way, Lucelene, as you were thinking, all right? And so some of these ideas of knowledge and material structures are, for me, the sources of this friction or this stickiness. That is, that the discourses and the justifications, the scientific knowledge base, the data series, the tools, the models that are used, the administrative rules and the laws and the policy cultures and the organizational cultures and the professional cultures that are embedded in agri-environmental policy over 25 years are real. They're great resources. They create efficiencies in doing a set of jobs and spending money and achieving a certain set of outcomes. And we can argue about the effectiveness of those outcomes, but they are real. They do a job, they have knowledge, they have culture, they have communication media. And now climate change is throwing a wrench into the works, a challenge and a different kind of challenge. And these switching costs are real, and these risks are real. So I want to suggest that agri-environmental policy grew out of a political negotiation in the 1980s that wasn't strictly about environment. Yes, there was an environmental movement. Yes, there was this thing called sustainable agriculture. But the reason, in my view, that we have agri-environmental policy is not because of the environmental crisis or the environmental effects of agriculture. Largely, it's the constellation or the collision between supply control. We basically had low prices for commodities in the 1980s, and there was tremendous need to support farmer incomes. And so agri-environmental policy grew out, on the one hand, a commitment to ecology and environmental risk reduction, but it also grew out of a commitment to supporting farmers' incomes. And it's quite important to keep this in mind, that the efficiency and the effectiveness of agri-environmental policy is not terrific from an ecological point of view. And one way to understand why we have inefficiency in agri-environmental policy is because it wasn't designed to be efficient from an ecological point of view. They were designed to put money in farmers' pockets, not save birds, save wetlands, save soil, reduce phosphorus. Yes, it wasn't one or the other, it's both. And that's the story. So when we have a kind of hardcore ecological imperative like reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it doesn't fit very well with this multifunctional commitment to balancing rural development, farmers' incomes, supply control, and ecology. And so that's part of this important mismatch. So agri-environmental policy is premised on voluntarism, not coercion. That is, farmers choose to participate in these agri-environmental schemes. The payments made to farmers are negotiated based on practices. Farmers are not paid for outcomes. They're not really paid on performance. A farmer implements a practice, they get paid, largely through a schedule of payments that are published. And you don't have competition as you would have in a market setting. Farmers don't really compete with one another, and farmers' feet are not held to the fire. Farmers are not held to strict contractual terms by the USDA or by taxpayers. They largely exist on a platform of solidarity. And so this idea of voluntarism, negotiated payments, and solidarity, I want to contrast that with payments for ecosystem services, which I would characterize as the basis of market-based offsets for greenhouse gas mitigation. In a PES scheme, you would be holding farmers accountable for additionality. They only get paid if they produce value. You would be disciplining farmers by holding them accountable for what they produce, value added. How much carbon did you avoid emitting, or how much carbon did you sequester? It's very different than relying on a schedule of payments to pay a farmer for a buffer strip, a grass waterway, tree planting, or retiring farmland. So this idea of paying for practice, where you have a list of approved agronomic practices, that's how agri-environmental policy is organized. Climate change mitigation would be organized in a very different way. The more greenhouse gases you avoid emitting, or the more greenhouse gases you sequester, the more you get paid. And this type of approach is very much a contrast to the history of agri-environmental policy. And above all, this idea of offsets would be market competition. Farmers would be competing with each other to be low-cost producers of ecosystem services. Whether it's an electric utility or the US government would be holding farmers accountable to producing lots of public value for little public money or private money. That's quite different than the solidarity that exists at present. So the mode of contracting, the type of scientific data that would be used to verify performance, the culture between the buyer and seller would all be quite different under a climate change. And so the last slide I want to offer is this summary slide to suggest that reasons that we don't have commitments currently in US agricultural policy to climate change mitigation. We can say that there's transaction cost problems, that the ability to contract with farmers is costly, the ability to do monitoring and measurement of greenhouse gas reductions. We don't have the science, or we don't have low-cost practical models that could be used effectively for the 2 million farmers or the 350 million crop acres. We don't have scientific agreement about the metrics and the standards by which this policy and these payments would be made. And those arguments exist, bullet points 1 and 2, in the microeconomic literature, agricultural economics, if you will. This third one about the policy communities and these policy networks as being embedded in certain commitments and certain histories and certain cultures, that's the argument that the research we're doing is contributing. And we're finding that Congress, the United States Department of Agriculture's farmers and the policy networks are actively, not hostile, but slow, resistant, and very cautious about taking on the market logic of climate change mitigation as we understand it from mainstream practice into this long history that's been carefully crafted. And so with that, I'll leave it.
I'm going to segue to a whole different arena in terms of talking about networks. Although we may be working our way from the grassroots towards those policy networks as time goes by. But let me tell you a little bit about Sustainable Tompkins. We got started in 2004 and incorporated as a nonprofit in 2007. And we have been working to pull people together and unite the people interested in sustainability and social justice in our community. I've lived here for 34 years, so I've watched things change. It's been a difficult journey, but also one that we can feel some sense of positive result from the work we've been doing together. So we have served in the role of connector, convener, and catalyst. And by that, we mean that we started by bringing lots of people together into relationship with each other, held lots of different gatherings of different kinds, convened people, and then we've ended up catalyzing a lot of initiatives throughout the community as a result of bringing people together. And let's see how this works. There it goes. So we've taken sort of a four-way strategy. We know from the social change literature that the most effective change comes when you're working from the top down and the bottom up. So we've engaged local policymakers, elected officials, and institutional leaders, as well as working in neighborhoods at the grassroots level. And we've done a lot, as I said, initial work was around building awareness, but if you're going to wake people up, you need to provide them with some infrastructure for doing things differently. So we've concentrated on building infrastructure for making change as well. Now, when we started this work, when you think about redesigning the ways, the systems in which we work and live, there's a lot that's connected. It's a system, and there's a lot of things to think about. And where do you get started? Well, a lot of us, our instinct might be to go for basics of food, energy, shelter, but we've argued that from the beginning, when you work on these things, you have to take into account other things such as health and justice. And it's don't wait until the end of finding your technological solution to remember to ask yourself about, is it a socially just solution? So you see here at the bottom, that's our logo. It's representing the triple bottom line of people, profit, and planet. And so a lot of our work is characterized by building the movement, the people part, greening the economy, and healthy systems, working on the environmental stewardship piece of it. And that triple bottom line is in a field of relationship. And so our work, we try to characterize it by taking this systems approach, seeing where the connections are, developing lots of community partnerships, focusing on justice, and also trying to deliver a message of shared responsibility, because I think that's one thing that American culture has allowed to atrophy, is a sense of shared responsibility. So in the people part of it, the movement building, we've done a lot of this connecting, especially in small groups initially, to put people into relationship with each other. This has helped strengthen people's convictions around the principles and practices of sustainable living. It's given them the social courage to go out and do more because they don't feel so alone. We heard that all the time in the early years. Now, I thought I was alone, and now I realize I'm not. And so people would go out and do more things. We've also built some infrastructure, which the sustainability map I'll explain in a bit. And we've done a lot of celebrating together through our Science of Sustainability program, which is an annual awards program and a party to just acknowledge what everybody's been doing over the past year. And people really like getting their certificate. And especially since we're trying to acknowledge even the little baby steps that maybe a mainstream business might be taking, it's helpful for shifting the social norms around sustainability behaviors. Here's the sustainability map. This is one of the pieces of infrastructure we've built. We have over 125 entities that are categorized into these 17 different types of sustainability-related behaviors. This helps especially newcomers who are moving to Ithaca find other like-minded individuals, or even if you're just a long-term resident who's awakening to these issues, you can find out what's going on. This also helps, I think, reduce a duplication. Starting up something and then finding out later, oh, that group is all there. There's 3 other groups already doing that. Don't need to start it myself. And then another important piece of the movement building has been our neighborhood mini grants program. We give out over $10,000 a year in these small grants to all sorts of, grassroots citizen groups. A lot of it has been on food. So we've bought many a deer fence for community gardens, but also bought tools and storage sheds and seeds and fruit trees and infrastructure. But also we've helped support a lot of civic engagement, especially in low-income youth and minority communities, because that's an important piece of sustainability, is civic engagement and leadership training, especially for the young who are inheriting the climate change mess. So we've maybe, I don't know, way over $40,000, 80 or more groups have been supported. It's been very successful, and this is an important piece of building a network in that people feel themselves to be part of the sustainability movement when they've gotten one of these mini grants and they're now connected to this larger movement. The other part that we've been working on is, the greening the economy piece, and we started out with a lot of education. Like the technology showcase was our community's first opportunity for the business class to learn about sustainable technologies. And the makeover workshop was to help businesses learn how to green their operations. We held the region's first Green Collar Career Fair, which educated community college students and high school students about the emerging job markets in the green area. And then some of the infrastructure we've built in this area, for example, Finger Lakes by Green is a website we did with solid waste, county solid waste. You can go on there and find out where to buy more sustainably produced cleaning supplies, office supplies, health, home and garden, etc. The Cayuga Local Investing Opportunity Network is trying to create the infrastructure for people to be able to shift their money out of Wall Street and into the local economy with direct investments in entrepreneurs who are developing green local businesses. And then these last two are networks that we have been involved in. I was a founding president of the Green Resource Hub, which is a spin-off, one of our working groups in the early days. And then the main project of the hub, which I helped start, is the Sustainable Enterprise and Entrepreneur Network. It's sort of like a green chamber of commerce. So it's all these businesses that are trying to work towards being triple bottom line businesses. And we provide a lot of education and networking and business-to-business marketing through the scene. And then the Building Bridges Partnership is one that started up a couple of years ago. The focus of this initiative is to make equity a primary driver of the economy. To put a focus on making sure we have figured out in the overall local economic system how to increase equity in both meanings of the word, both equity as fairness of opportunity and access to capital and training, and equity as ownership, a piece of owning the means of making a profit. So you can see there were quite a few partners that have been involved in this initiative, and it's hard to do this kind of work because most of us, like I have no funding to go and be part of this. So, my participation is spotty because of time constraints. We're a very tiny nonprofit, 1.4 FTE. Nobody even works full time or gets paid full time. Let's clarify that. But it at least has been, it's been a very worthwhile thing to be involved in, and it's a growing network that is now connected to another network, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So the third area, the third of the triple bottom lines, healthy ecosystems. We've done a lot on health and in the health sector and in basic smart growth design, which I won't go into today because the focus is on climate, but we've certainly done a lot of different things on energy and climate. Again, starting with some of that small group learning to building infrastructure and networks. And we've done a lot of public education on energy. One of the bits of infrastructure we've built is the Finger Lakes Energy Challenge, which we put together as the fracking fight opened up in 2009. Because one of the accusations against the people trying to defend their homelands from fracking is that they were hypocrites and NIMBYs because they weren't doing anything about reducing the demand for natural gas. It's a supply and demand curve. So this Finger Lakes Energy Challenge provides a platform online where people can go and demonstrate their personal commitment to reducing their own consumption of fossil fuels. And so we have pledges for homeowners or tenants, business owners or businesses that are tenants. And it only takes a few minutes to do. Here's an example of one under transportation. You can get credit with a green check mark for the things you're already doing, and you can pledge which ones you want to take on in the next year or so. Then you can always come back to your pledge and update it as you go. So we've been doing outreach to some of the anti-fracking groups in the region. We had a partnership in last few months with the group in Tioga County, RAFT, Residents Against Fracking Tioga. And so working with them, we held 2 events. We had a movie about the first climate refugees in the Carteret Islands and had a discussion about climate justice. And then a couple weeks later, we held this energy teach-in in which we were helping the people in their movement as well as other people nearby. Village of Owego, by the way, is the one that went almost completely underwater from Tropical Storm Lee in 2011. So they're a little more sensitized to climate and take it pretty seriously down there. So that's kind of we're trying to grow a network connecting the concern over fracking with concern over climate. Our other infrastructure is the Finger Lakes Climate Fund, which is the only local carbon offset fund. And people can offset the emissions from their travel or from their home. Oh, it's moving by itself. And then the money goes to grants to low-income households in our community who couldn't otherwise do the scope of work to make their house more energy efficient. So that's how the carbon gets offset, is in grants to local folks. And we're working with trying to create networks of people doing this particular piece of the work that needs to be done. We've been working with a couple of faith congregations where they've adopted the Climate Fund and are trying to reach particular goals for their congregation in terms of offsets. And that's been some interesting learnings in terms of the resistance to taking responsibility for your emissions. There's immediately, as soon as you draw attention to people's emissions by making them calculate it, there's discomfort that arises and a sense of guilt, and they just don't want to know about it. They'd rather make a donation to charity and help those low-income people fix up their house. Don't tell me about my footprint. So there's resistance in the culture. Here's another network and partnership that's ongoing. A lot of there was, I don't know, something like 40 different organizations, I think, were involved in creating the Get Your Green Back Tompkins campaign, which is being run out of Cooperative Extension, because we were trying to design something that could spread actually to all of the households in Tompkins County and inspire people to take some step towards reducing their emissions. And it's framed in a monetary way, obviously, get your green back. For those of you who don't know, greenback is a slang term for the US dollar. It's jiggling along, but it also is, got some things to, we're still puzzling over the framing of things. And that brings me to the network I'm currently helping to co-create. Our Assemblywoman, Barbara Lifton, who's the state assembly representative for Tompkins and Cortland counties, came to us last fall and the Atkinson Center, I think towards the end of the summer, with the proposal that a bunch of us get together and hold some kind of a conference. She has been an incredible leader on fracking. And of course, having to know all about that and work on that particular battle. But then she read a book called Hot, Living Through the Next 50 Years on Earth by Mark Hertsgaard, and got inspired to start worrying about climate, both mitigation and adaptation. And so we've got this coalition that's come together. That's a picture of Mark Hertsgaard, who will be our keynoter and will be involved throughout the 4 days of the conference. This is April 18th to the 21st, by the way, in Ithaca and Cortland. And there are tracks. I mentioned this multi-sector coalition, so it's Cornell and Ithaca College and SUNY Cortland, Sustainable Cortland and Sustainable Tompkins, a number of businesses, as well as the assembly level represented, of course, the state government represented, county government, city government, and town governments. So we've got quite a few different groups involved in this initiative. And we identified early on that we really need to design this conference to reach local government. It's time to really try to reach more of the policymakers, because a lot of the adaptation that we're looking at is not only that we still need to reduce emissions, but now we have to deal with what's already coming at us in terms of climate impacts. And so, but most of the people that I know who serve on planning boards and town boards never even heard of the Climate Report, which is the state's significant analysis done by quite a few Cornell faculty as participants in that, in terms of what are the specific impacts that we're going to see in our area, and how will that flow out into our economy, into our quality of life, into public health, into whether or not we're going to be able to produce the crops that we used to produce, and have landscapes that look at all like what we're used to cherishing as our local landscapes. So we'll be having a track aimed at local government, a track for Main Street business, a track for community leaders, the people who are waking up as concerned citizens but don't feel qualified really, to have strong conversations with others. So those sessions will be about giving them more tools and more knowledge to be more effective, either in arguing with their brother-in-law or at work, or motivating the groups and civic organizations they're part of to get engaged on this topic. And then there will be a whole Youth Justice Summit going on up at Ithaca College for Saturday and Sunday. And what we're hoping for after these 4 days of activities together is that we'll have more people in this conversation about climate, and we will be able to identify some next steps for working together. From the beginning, we've been trying to use the frame of protecting and preparing our communities, because many of our rural traditionalists in upstate rural New York, people are used to emergency preparedness and emergency response. The volunteer fire department, that's part of our cultural norms. And so we're trying to frame this response to climate in that this is what the grown-up responsible adults always do. We figure out how to protect our communities. So that's what a lot of this will be, hearing from the American Red Cross and their new community resiliency pilots that they're putting together, so that people can begin to see it's not enough to just run out after the house is on fire. You have to, reduce the number of fires, and so and that's a lot more cost effective. So we're hopeful that that this will be a network that we can widen and start changing the policies that go with it at the local level. So that's it.
So good afternoon again. Today I'll be the last speaker of the day, the last speaker of the seminar, and I want to be optimistic, but we need to see something that's not really good. And so I will talk about the climate change in Brazil, the networks that work, starting with this quotation from Herbert Souza Betinho, that was a very important sociologist in Brazil. And he was responsible to start a movement pro-ethics in politics, and he was responsible to start some networks that I'm going to talk about today. And so he is stay with us until today. So I will talk about the networks that work, and they work for what? And we need to think about it. So you already showed to us today which kind of goals the networks has to have or have. And so I will talk about a little bit about this and about vulnerability and impacts of climate change, current public policy, networks driving climate change to design public policy, and networks that are implementing public policies. Because we have to think about in these two directions. And I would say that basically, but not only, we could say that the networks can work top-down, implementing public policies, and in a bottom-up direction, driving climate change to design public policies. And so we need these two approaches to cope with the challenges. So we have a lot of examples that you have done. And what do networks work for? So I do believe that the networks working with climate change has to build a more resilient society. That means, and resilience means a capacity of a body or a system to absorb a shock while maintaining function. And when we think in integrated system of people and nature, we have to pay attention in three key attributes. That is the ability to get back, the self-organization of the system, and the ability to build and increase capacity for learning and adaptation. So having said that, I will show you this index that the GAN Institute created. That is a combination of the vulnerability of the countries with the readiness of the country to improve resilience. And so here we have a map that they created that shows us how the countries are in terms of the GAN index. And we can see that Brazil, it's not too bad. But when we compare to other countries, but when we compare the countries in terms of the opportunities for the economic development, but which kind of economic development we are going to do. So is Brazil in green like this, or a little bit more yellow or red? Because to respond to this question, we need to see to respond or to keep with this question, because I don't have the answer. But we need to see some aspects and some data that are more regional and more specific. So Brazil is a continental country, as the US, and our forest covered about 30% of the total area. And here you can see the savanna, that's called Cerrado, one wetland, Pantanal. Here dryland that is covered by the Caatinga vegetation. The Atlantic forest that was covered by the Atlantic forest. Nowadays, we have about 7% of this forest. This is the most populated region and more developed region too. Here, the pinus forest and the grasslands, the pampas. So this was where the original vegetation that we had in Brazil. In terms of our economy, we are growing. We have a lot of investments to build new infrastructure for the Cup, for the Olympics. And in terms of GDP, our economy is the 8th in the ranking. And the main contributor is the service sectors, followed by the industrial sector and agriculture, but the agriculture is very important in terms of balanced trade. Balanced trade? Yeah. And when we compare the GDP, the rank in the GDP with the Human Development Index, we can see that Brazil is not really good. So we are the 84th in the ranking because we are rich but very unequal. So in terms of population, we are almost 200 million people. 84% of the population live in urban areas, 6% in slums, and 20% of the Brazilians are under the poverty line. So we need to keep developing the country, but we need to be more, we need to have a country more equitable. Oh, thank you. So, but we need to see which kind of development we are doing. In terms of CO2 per capita, we could see that Brazil and other developing countries are considered low carbon economies when we compare to developed countries. So, but after the financial crisis, the developing countries started to emit more CO2 in terms of amount when we compare to developed countries. So this is a trend that it started during this period, and we have to pay attention and which kind of development we are going to do in the future, because we have a lot of people in Brazil, China, India, Africa that needs to be included in the development. In Brazil, the emissions came mainly from the deforestation. But the good news is that the rate of the deforestation is decreasing. And in 2008, we have decreased by 40% this rate. So this is something that we are emitting more CO2, but at the same time, we are doing something to reduce the CO2 emissions. When you see the scenarios that we are going to have in the future, so here is the country. We can, in terms of change in rainfall average, the North and the Midwest are going to be drier, much more drier. And this area are going to be wetter. In terms of change in temperature average, the North and the Midwest are going to be warmer. So in the impacts, we are talking about the impacts in the B2 scenario. That is a scenario that we assumed that we are going to reduce the CO2 emissions. So it's an optimistic scenario. So, but we are going to have a reduction in our GDP. In the North, we will have a delay in the rainfall season. And the Amazon forests are going to become a savanna. So we have about 30%, 40% of the forests that are going to be savanna in the future. And you have a reduction in the moisture that comes from this area to provoke rainfall in the Midwest and the Southeast part. In the Northeast, we have will be warmer and drier as the North, and this area that is already arid, in some parts are going to be a desert, And we have a reduction in livelihood agriculture, main impacts in bean, corn, and cassava production. And in some states, the agricultural land are going to be reduced by 65 to 8%. So it will be a tragedy for this region. In the Midwest, we will have a reduction in the biodiversity. And I need to say that we have uncertainty in the rainfall average. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in this area, but we certainly will have a reduction in the biodiversity in the Cerrado and Pantanal, and in reduction in power generation. You know, Brazil, our electricity comes from the dams, so we are going to have some reductions and reduction in agriculture. And the Southwest, we will have some similar impacts. I will just highlight the extreme weather events that are more common nowadays and will be more common in the future. And you have reduction in coffee, that is a very important production in our agriculture. In the south, we have a reduction in rainfall average, but we will have heavier rain, extreme weather events, and as the other parts, reduction in power generation. So these sands are common every summer seasons in Brazil. These are happening in the southeast and south, and these happening in the northeast and in south area. About the public policies, we have two main public policies. One is the National Plan for Climate Change, and another one is the Pluriannual Plan that has a program about climate change. And I need to say that the National Plan was built with a very participatory process, with a lot of regional consultations. So nowadays, I can be proud that we have a democratic process that is improving every year, but it's not perfect. We have a lot of problems in this area, but this is another issue that we are going to talk other day. In our sectorial plans, we have plans to reduce the Amazon deforestation, Cerrado deforestation, to consolidate the low carbon economy in processing industry, an energy plan, mitigation adaptation for mining, health and transportation, and human mobility. And these are very important goals that we have established in these sectorial plans. So, but now I will show you which networks, what networks have influenced the construction of the national plan. And I will start with the Climate Observatory that was born in 2000. And in 2004, they made a manifest to encourage the government to design the national plan. And in 2007, the Brazilian Forum of NGOs and Social Movements made a petition to encourage the government again, and finally in 2008, with this branch, that's the forum that the government established to have the participation of the civil society, the private sector, and they designed the national plan. And this network that is the COAP is part of the forum, the Brazilian Climate Change Forum. They are working, they have been working with the Climate Change and Poverty Plan. So without these networks, I would say that we will be designing the national plan. And now here we can see a proposal of that COEP in the Brazilian Forum is preparing to detail this part of the national plan, because the plan is very detailed in terms of mitigation opportunities, but in terms of vulnerability and adaptation is not yet. And so the proposal is working in this direction. And now I will show you some implementations, some networks that are working with implementation of public policies and connecting. This is a bank of experience that is based in COEP website. And so this network is based in Amazon area, and they are improving the knowledge of the indigenous peoples and traditional communities to cope with climate change, connecting the actions, the local actions to global negotiations. So it's a very interesting network. We need to connect this both approach, no? And the other experience is in the Northeast, the arid part of the country. And this network is working with small farmers, helping them to cope with the droughts. As you can see here, they are working with some watering kits and helping them to produce in greenhouses and introducing solar panels and some technologies to adapt to the drought and to adapt to the drought that are going to be worse in the future. So I finalized my presentation. Now, just saying that I believe that the networks could accelerate the definition of the public policies, apply and improve public policies, foster an awareness through the society. Because Brazil is working, but the government is working, but slowly. We need to accelerate the process, because the problem, we are facing the challenges, the problems nowadays. And one interesting thing that I have observed, that the networks are composed, these networks that I showed you, are composed with all the sectors of the society. And I believe when we have all the sectors together, we can play a different role than when we are in our own sector. Because when we are in our own sector, we have to defend the sector, But when we are in a network that is involving all the sectors, we can play a different role, and we can do better. We can do. So I believe in that. I need to believe in that, and thank you. So now the discussion is open, and feel free.
So, Lou, it's a question to you and to Kate. So these papers were somewhere, these presentations were somewhere parallel. What are the components that are missing from these networks? So you at the end said that the network is cutting across many lines and quite integrative. But are there some gap or some hole or some interest group that's not represented sufficiently? And the same question to Gay. So is there some missing piece?
Which specific?
To move to the next level, constraining,
climate.
yes, with your Tompkins County and
At the local
regional.
level.
And the same to Lucas. You've characterized it as the network is there. But my question is, are you missing something?
So I think what is missing is, it's interesting because in all these networks we have all the sectors, the private sector, the government, but inside the private sector, the governments, and even in civil society, we have other interests that are not represented in that networks. So they play, it's a tradition. And so when we are changing, we are trying to change, I believe you showed the contradiction, in some contradictions in the beginning. And so I think what we are missing is the hard part of the sectors, is those that are less interested. It's quite obvious, but
And I would say that it's about becoming top of mind, because I think the data, the polls show that 70% of Americans agree now, finally, that climate change is happening and that the government ought to do something about it. But there are so many people who still aren't internalizing that to what they ought to be doing, whether that's at the household level or as the mayor of a city, in terms of making it a priority. You know, I mean, I've watched this for a while, and people will make these climate commitments, but then not do anything about changing work plans and budgets, you know, because it just hasn't become the priority where you're going to put the effort. And in a way, the spur of climate change is now upon us, and so the areas, you know, we've had Hurricane Irene, Tropical Storm Lee, Hurricane Sandy. Tompkins County's dodged the bullet all 3 times on those, but it should give us a clue that maybe we won't dodge the next bullet. So we need to start making these things top of mind. And also, in an era of very tight budgets, now we have to do this smart work of figuring out what kind of investments can we make that will both reduce our emissions, so to be more climate friendly, and reduce the long-term hit that we're going to take, at the same time that also makes us more resilient and able to cope with what's coming at us already. And, you know, to me, the good news is that the sustainability movement and the social justice movements are all about resilience, and we're already laying the groundwork for local community resilience through all the community gardens, through all even just the engagement processes where people aren't so passive about how we're going to deal with emergencies and prepare for them. And we really have zero leadership from the federal level. You know, we've known for a long time that the action's at the local level in the United States, you know, because it's just completely stalled out at the federal level. You know, huge resistance to change. And that's why the work at the grassroots level is important, because it does start to change things. I mean, that's the strategy around the emergency preparedness and the resilience, is we're trying to normalize preparedness. Just like 10 years ago, people weren't in the habit of putting off their recycling every 2 weeks. And it was all confusing and people resented it. You know, and it was amazing how much flack there was around recycling. And now it's normal. Everybody knows how to do that. So that's, you know, that's kind of the direction we have to help move people towards. And elected officials, I don't think, some lead and many follow. So that's why it's important to have the NGO sector and faith groups and, you know, higher ed and everybody involved in pushing them in that direction.
So I have a question for Stephen's talk. So maybe put a slightly more positive spin on your results, or at least have some comments about things, especially what the USDA is doing. So your analysis that it's hard to get out of the AEP situation that we're in. I mean, could it in part be because it's much more ecologically adapted? So I've been involved in some of these policies coming out of the California cap and trade, sort of cap and trade bill. And it's really, I mean, it really is the case that our scientific ability to actually prove greenhouse gas reductions is very limited, as well as the fact that the ability to pay, the risk pushed on farmers for the policies that have come out are really great. And so in some sense, the kind of conservation policies we've had, I think, do align much more with the ecological philosophies of, we've got data that suggests certain practices really do make a difference. We can't prove that the practice is working on this land parcel, but sort of overall we've got a lot of evidence suggesting it's a good practice to support. Whereas these policies that are coming out of the California initiative really want to push the risk on one group of farmers to say, okay, prove to us that you haven't had a reduction in yield when you implemented this practice that we've asked you to implement, which is sort of crazy. Why would someone take that on if they have to absorb the risk of implementing the practice that they've been asked to do? And I guess my understanding of the European emissions trading is that, at least until this year, they haven't actually implemented agricultural projects. So they too have embraced this problem, and they've sort of focused on energy. So, is it the case that people who have markets are sort of recognizing this limitation of the sort of trading of greenhouse gases in the agricultural sector, that they're realizing it's not entirely aligned with our understanding of the ecology? And then just to kind of promote some of the things the USDA has done, I feel like while there might be policy limitations, I've been reviewing a lot of the greenhouse gas accounting that the USDA and EPA have supported. So I feel like they've invested a lot of their scientists' time in really understanding where our emissions come from. And so to me, it acknowledges that they care about these issues. They're thinking about how can we make a contribution, even if we're not ready at the policy stage to know how to do that. They've really outlined that for us, manure management and things like that, leaking from other things like landfills are our highest methane contribution, not rice production in the U.S. So I don't know, I feel like there is optimism on that.
The only thing I can say is that a place like the USDA is a huge place, and there's lots of different interests inside USDA. And there's a hardcore environmental science part of USDA, which is producing the kinds of things you're talking about. But there's a whole different part of USDA that is quite dismissive of modeling, that they're very dedicated to working with farmers. They love pickup trucks, and they love clipboards. And it's a very different culture, and they're very unwilling to sacrifice the cordial and solidarity relations that they've built up over generations with farmers who self-select. That was Lucy's point about who's in the network. It self-selects for people. So I agree with everything you said, but that ecological science knowledge has not been mainstream, and there is a battle going on in and outside USDA to make that more prominent. But our research shows that it's in tension, but it's certainly not displacing the traditional mode of let's just ballpark it, and we'll use some rules of thumb, and we'll do our best guess. So, does that help?
That also, in terms of the kind of the first point, that is there something more synergistic with the old paradigm towards the way our ecological knowledge is grounded, that is part of the reason why we're not moving towards adopting these more market-based solutions?
I don't know. That's the research question. Is that in what places? So why do we have agreement, although it's fractious, on greenhouse gas equivalents that allow for carbon trading? And then we almost have wetland trading, but many people think it's garbage. We don't really have biodiversity trading. So what are the domains of scientific knowledge that are understood at a level that gives us confidence about making claims about equivalence across time and space? So I think it's an interesting question. What areas do we have policy consensus, and what areas do we have scientific consensus that makes it fly? And in other places where we're at square one. Is it politics? Is it science? I think it's a combination.
Questions? No?
Yes.
I would like to be an optimist, so I'm looking for some help here. So I do biophysical science at the landscape and regional and national scales. I worked with a really interesting group a few years ago and kind of got my feet wet or maybe burned a little bit on the question of managing wildfire in the United States, which is a really interesting, difficult problem. There's lots of people involved. But briefly, we're not doing a very good job of it. It's hugely expensive and people die every year. We have these ideas about managing fire and how it could be a good thing, but when it comes down to somebody's house being threatened, even if it's a house where it shouldn't be, we have to throw all our resources at it and put that fire out. So we're building more and more houses in very vulnerable places, and people kind of know this, I think. So in terms of public knowledge, we should be evolved further in terms of fire, at least in fire-prone ecosystems. And similarly with hurricanes, right? They come along pretty regularly in many parts of the country, and they knock down buildings and kill people and destroy property. But then we build again in the same spots. So I'm looking for some help about what can we learn about those, failures, and how do we improve on those and think about that in terms of working on climate change.
No. You won't get much optimism from me. The system's completely irrational. There's no commitment at significant levels to address these problems. The data is somewhere in tension with that statement. I think they're both true. I think 70% of people live in fear of climate change, and 100% of people, 98% of people have no intention at core to change what they do.
Just as an anecdote, I surveyed my family members last Thanksgiving. Did they believe, that climate was changing, and what did they think would happen? And they all thought it was happening. They all could name some reasonable impacts to expect, and not a single one of them said anything about what they would do. It was all projection out onto somebody else to fix it. The government ought to get working on that. So it's too small of a number of people who are dedicating themselves to making change and walking their talk and living by their values. But I do think it's time to start having conversations with policymakers in tight budget years, and try to find a time that you can get their attention, help them focus, and show that society cannot afford to rebuild all those houses in Rockaway and all these vulnerable places. We can't afford those multi-tens of billion-dollar bailouts again and again and again. And so two of our sessions are on risk and liability, and how the insurance companies are saying bye-bye, to all you policyholders, and you better wake up to the fact that you won't be getting private insurance and the public won't be able to bail you out anymore. Now, does it make sense to rebuild in the same place? And that's what we need to tell people who are out in the fire-prone areas, just like the people in the floodplain. Floodplains move, and the fire zones move. And you're going to lose everything if you insist on being there. Are you ready for that? And that's, I think, how stark we have to make it.
But this too big to fail problem comes, that even if we do give hard talk about private insurance and unwillingness to declare disasters again and again, it's too big to fail. And so I think it would be wonderful if I'm sure you've heard these arguments before about insurance change, but I don't think we're very serious about that.
Well, what happens is that the low-income people are the ones who won't get, won't get rescued, and where the more powerful and the connected houses are at risk, they'll be protected.
So I just finished that. I do believe that the connections that we can do are more powerful than that just the academy or just some part of the society. And thank you everyone to came here, and I hope I can see you again other time, and we can have a better time with all these challenges. Thank you.